Now here we are to our main event, and it gives me a great pleasure to introduce in just a moment Robert Walls, who's going to talk about Indigenous books of the Pacific Northwest, why they matter. He wrote an article for our journal, which you all probably have received and hopefully enjoyed. Bob Walls was born and raised in New York City. He fled west and studied anthropology at the University of Washington. And he worked for a bookstore. Then he went to Indiana University, where he received his PhD. From the early 1990s until recently, he taught Indigenous studies and environmental studies at Lafayette College, University of South Carolina, and University of Notre Dame. He's an author and editor of 3 books, most recently Resilience Through Writing, a bibliographic guide to Indigenous authored publications in the Pacific Northwest before 1960. He's married to Laura Dussault Walls, who is a scholar of Thoreau and the Transcendentalists. Laura is there. She is. She's there in the back. Thank you for being here. I met you before I met Bob at the book fair last year. So there you go. They recently they now live in Edmonds, where Bob and Laura decided to retire to. So with further ado, Bob, please.
Thank you, Gary, very much. I really love the opportunity to talk to everyone, welcome everyone, those of you who are here, those of you who are Zooming in. I'm glad to be able to talk to you this afternoon. I'm flattered by the invitation to speak before the Book Club of Washington, and grateful for the opportunity to talk about one of my favorite things, books and the Pacific Northwest. I want to personally thank Gary Ackerman, David Wertheimer, Tamara Belts, Cindy Richardson, Tim Schmidt, and of course Bonnie Thompson Norman of Windowpane Press for her wonderful design of the keepsake. Thank you. It's really beautiful. I was looking at it just before. I hope I can get 2 of them. I can hang one of them on my wall. And naturally, I must thank and acknowledge my wife, Laura Dussault Walls, my partner in book crimes, biographer of Henry David Thoreau and Barry Lopez, who has for years endured my hauls from used bookstores, my cursing during eBay auctions, my ceaseless search for more bookshelf space. With this audience here today, I may not be alone with this affliction. I'm not a book historian. I have no training in the field, but I do love books. And now that I'm here in the Northwest and learning more about the Book Club of Washington, I'm already learning a bunch from those of you who are members about the pleasures of books, about book making, about antiquarian collecting, and a lot more. Like many of you, I've enjoyed the book world of Seattle for decades, starting in the mid-1970s when I moved here from New York City, when I found places like Red and Black Books on the Ave and Left Bank Books at the Market, and discovered their diverse selections of alternative presses, feminist, queer, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, working class, environmental, often with radical, subversive, and just plain different viewpoints. Publications definitely not accessioned by most libraries. Perusing the shelves of these stores and glancing at the colorful posters that were often adorning the walls listening to the latest rants of some wild-eyed clerk, were all constant reminders that my UW education was providing just a small slice of what I needed to know in life. And then I discovered Wesleyan Lieberman's store in Pioneer Square and learned that my budget for antiquarian books was not compatible with feeding my cats on a regular basis. But I've also appreciated the opportunities also for research in many of the regional special collections of the area, UW, Washington State University, Western Washington University, University of Idaho, and quite a few others. So I extend my gratitude to all of those places and their staff. I also, perhaps most of all, extend my humble appreciation to the Indigenous intellectuals and historians that I've known over the years, such as Lita Maurer, librarian, historian at the Haybulb Cultural Center at Tulalip. And of course, Vi Hilbert, a friend and mentor for many years. More on her in a little bit. I still believe that land acknowledgements are important as gestures of gratitude and as teachable moments. We are on the traditional territory of Coast Salish people, particularly Lushootseed speaking people. This is Lushootseed Swatitad, Lushootseed land. And I want to acknowledge specifically the Duwamish and the Muckleshoot people who have used this land for thousands of years and continue to do so. And while we're at it, I'd like us to remember one of the nicest formal gestures of Indigenous acknowledgement in Seattle. One that recognizes the link between ancestral Indigenous territories and books themselves in the entrance to the Suzzallo Allen Library, an acknowledgement that uses Lushootseed language and art as a type of blessing to the learning that can occur in libraries. So let me start. One way to discuss Indigenous books, there's a lot of ways to begin this topic. One way to address Indigenous books and why they matter is to describe the genealogies of books, books within families, communities, and Indigenous cultural traditions. We can start with something new and hopefully familiar. There was a full-page article in the Seattle Times last week on Sacha Lapointe, and I hope you had a chance to see that. Her work as an Upper Skagit Nooksack author, her name, Takshablu. She is now a nationally prominent author of 3 books, with her first Red Paint winning the Washington State Book Award in 2023. In this compelling memoir, she writes of the challenges of being a 21st century Indigenous woman, persistent stereotypes, the potential for gendered violence, and surviving through her own personal embrace of traditional spirituality. As she writes, she reflects upon the influence of her extended relations, especially on her great-grandmother, Vi Hilbert, from whom she inherited her ancestral name. Some of you may know, Vi Hilbert, Takshablu, also her name, was an Upper Skagit elder who became an instructor at University of Washington, a National Heritage Fellow, and a distinguished public figure in Seattle. An indefatigable spirit who documented and revived Lushootseed language and its literature in the Puget Sound area from the 1960s up to her death in 2008. Though renowned for her oral performances of traditional stories, a critical part of Vi's strategy involved publishing books and materials for her classroom and for public education. She worked with UW Press and her own imprint, Lushootseed Research, to issue a remarkable assortment of language textbooks, dictionaries, story collections, and oral histories, most of which are still available through Lushootseed Research, which you can quickly Google online. Vi Hilbert, in turn, was influenced by 2 of her older relatives. Her cousin, Martin Sampson, an important leader at Swinomish, began his own writing career in 1906 in the pages of an Indian boarding school journal, and he continued authoring newspaper articles and 2 books on Coast Salish history and culture, most notably a collection of narratives, the Swinomish Totem Pole, published through WPA funding in 1938, that explained a story pole that stood at Swinomish, a recently carved pole that reproduced the history and traditional knowledge formerly represented in the house posts in pre-contact longhouses. We got to remember those wonderful longhouses, some of them very, very large, like Old Man House over at Suquamish. They had house posts that held the roof structure, and those house posts were carved and painted with traditional knowledge, ancestral knowledge, and that was used as a classroom for youth to instruct them about their histories, about their values, traditional stories, and what was important for Coast Salish to be a mature Coast Salish individual. And so many of those house posts were, of course, destroyed when longhouses were burned or dismantled by settlers over the years. Beginning in the mid-1920s, Vi was also influenced and inspired by her first mother-in-law, Chinook Quinault woman, Myrtle Johnson Woodcock, who lived at South Bend, Washington, in Pacific County on Willapa Bay, and who was a former classmate of Martin Sampson. Woodcock was a descendant of two high-status leaders, one a Quinault from Grays Harbor, and the other a Chinook from Celilo Falls on the Columbia River. And not surprisingly, through the years, she too became an important leader for the Chinook people, an indigenous nation that had been fragmented over the past 2 centuries by the forces of colonial disruptions, yet a nation that today still seeks federal recognition. However, Woodcock was also was one of the first indigenous poets to have her verse published in regional newspapers and published in the very first Northwest Indigenous Poetry chapbooks issued in the 1920s. This was not simply the sentimental verse of the times. It was, in essence, an attempt to indigenize modern poetry to remember, preserve, and teach Chinook history, as indicated by the titles of her chapbooks. The Alliance of the Quinault and Chinook Tribes tells of a historical intertribal agreement to share territory between the Quinault and Chinook, yet retain separate cultural identities. A Chinook legend, a second chapbook containing the poem A Dark Day, recounts a tribe's reaction to a solar eclipse as a breach of social laws. For this writing, Woodcock interviewed tribal elders for their knowledge of historical events, fashioned it into verse, published it herself, and required her children, grandchildren, and other tribal youth to memorize it as a means to both keep historical memory alive and help reconstitute the Chinook Nation. Woodcock's artistry and activism are remembered today fondly by tribal descendants, including most poignantly by her great-great-granddaughter, Sasha LaPointe, in her recent memoirs. Starting with Myrtle Johnson Woodcock and extending through Martin Sampson and Vi Hilbert and leading to Sasha LaPointe, we can trace a lineage of writers across the face of Western Washington, authors who indigenized publishing in their own ways, engaging with the technologies and expressive forms of modernity. They saw publication as an act of power, a tool to restate and preserve threatened histories, languages, and traditions, and a means to connect through time and space with their relations of family, community, and ancestral lands. They taught others what was possible through books, that books could both enhance the visibility of and provide mobility for indigenous ideas, hopes, and solutions. Indigenous books mattered. Of course, this is not news to indigenous communities in the Northwest, Indian country. In 2013, the Colville Reservation in Eastern Washington hosted a 2-day gathering commemorating the remarkable Mourning Dove and her literary accomplishments 80 years before. They honored both the writings and descendants of the Colville author, as well as the work of many subsequent Colville authors, in an event that one could describe as a living bibliography. On Puget Sound, the Hebulb Cultural Center at Tulalip hosted for 2 years a popular exhibit, The Power of Words, that examined the Coast Salish engagement with alphabetic literacy over 168 years. Really hope some of you had a chance to see it. It's gone now, but I hope you had a chance to see this magnificent exhibit, the first of its kind in the Pacific Northwest. It featured displays of books and serials and a host of documents from the Mukilteo Treaty, dictionaries of Chinook jargon, diaries, native authored collections of oral traditions, to 21st century novels and poetry chapbooks in the Lushootseed language. Clearly, for both Tulalip and Colville, Indigenous books constitute a national literature that matters. The genealogy of books and authorship I've just described is only one of hundreds of similar genealogies in the Pacific Northwest and throughout North America. It's a 400-year legacy of publishing that many of you are likely familiar with and have heard of some of these books. It starts with the Eliot Bible, the first Bible printed in British North America. It was printed by an indigenous Nipmuc man, James Printer, in the Wampanoag language. It's followed by William Apes' autobiographical Son of the Forest in 1829, describing the life of a Pequot preacher and political activist. It's also the first Indigenous work to be under copyright. Everyone knows of the Cherokee Phoenix, the newspaper established in 1828, utilizing both English and the syllabary, invented by Sequoyah, deemed dangerous enough as a newspaper that the Georgia Guard, during removal, destroyed the press and scattered the type. Later, there were books by Potawatomi leader Simon Pokagon, some of which were printed on birch bark as a gesture of cultural continuity to the people's ancient custom of inscribing sacred information on bark scrolls. And lastly, the many writings of Dakota authors Itkalasha, otherwise known as Gertrude Simmons Bonin, and Charles Eastman early in the 20th century, who employed books to preserve cultural history, but more importantly, argue before a vast audience of Americans that for Indian citizenship and badly needed Indian policy reforms. But where does the Pacific Northwest fit into this textual history? Most of you will be familiar with the late 19th century written versions of Chief Seattle, and Chief Joseph's speeches, now iconic representations of Indigenous eloquence. And some of you may be aware of the post-1960s poetry and prose of individuals like Dwayne Naidam, Sherman Alexie, Eden Robinson, Rena Priest, and so many others. However, it remains surprisingly easy to leapfrog an entire century from Chief Seattle to Sherman Alexie. What Indigenous voices came between these two figures remains unclear. And what voices came prior to the speeches, what written voices came prior to the speeches of Seattle and Joseph is even lesser known territory. The fact is, Indigenous people in the Northwest who have been on this land for at least the last 18,000 years have been inscribing information on material surfaces for millennia. We can consider rock art, pictographs, petroglyphs as a type of writing, a type of literacy, ritually placed for later readings on sites that could be thought of as the first libraries. A tribal collection of information on Indigenous land use, natural resources, historical events, and connections between physical and spiritual worlds. After contact, and the availability, the introduction of paper through trade, similar knowledge was drawn in blank books, such as the cryptic Stalo Dream Book, like I'm showing here, as it's been called. It was found in the Fraser River Valley in British Columbia. Or in this Nez Perce ledger book from the 1880s, where the captions written by a white settler interact with native illustrations, creating a kind of dialogue between narrators and cultures. Items like this dream book and this ledger book raise questions. What does constitute a book? What is authorship? Missionaries brought the first printing press to Lapwai, Idaho, from Hawaii in 1839 to facilitate the adoption of Christianity and the teaching of alphabetic literacy in the plateau, producing the very first books printed in the Northwest, such as this children's primer on the right in the Nez Perce language. By 1855, an illustration by Gustav Sohan depicts Nez Perce men taking notes during treaty negotiation, just prior to their older leaders leaving their X marks, X signatures on the treaty itself. An example that brings to mind the astute observation of Standing Rock Sioux indigenous scholar Vine Deloria Jr., who with characteristic wit and a sense of irony once noted, when they arrived, they had only the book and we had the land. Now we have the book and they have the land. Only 15 years after the Stevens Treaties, Yakima, Nez Perce, Skokomish, and Puyallup, such as Peter Stan up here, began routinely publishing letters, poetry, articles, and even the beginning of a romance novel in Tacoma, Seattle, and other Puget Sound newspapers, also on the east side in the Yakima area. Some individuals claimed authorship to books when their name was omitted from the title page, such as the Nez Perce writer James Rubin, known for his bold letters to the editor on Chief Joseph's intentions, published before the 1877 war. Those of you who know your history know how that's significant. Nobody really thought to look for native Nez Perce writing before the war to find out exactly what they were thinking. On a gift copy to a missionary, Rubin crossed out the name of the putative translator in order to write his own name as the true translator of Johnam Test, the Book of John, published in 1876 in Nimuputint, the Nez Perce language. This copy being in the University of Idaho special collections. The work that I've been doing over the past few years, which is really just beginning, is an attempt to recover this largely unrecognized legacy of writing and publishing, identifying individual writers and tribal genealogies of authors. As Carl Thrush, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, demonstrated so nicely in his wonderful book, Native Seattle, indigenous and urban histories are not mutually exclusive. Native people actively participated in shaping this city with their own interests in mind. I'm trying to do something similar, illustrating that indigenous and non-indigenous print histories of the Northwest are also not mutually exclusive, that indigenous people were not passive victims of written representations of indigeneity. In fact, indigenous people wrote and published a great deal in the early Northwest, attempting to define themselves publicly on their own terms as modern residents of the region. This raises an obvious question. Why hasn't this history of indigenous publishing been told before? And I'd appreciate hearing some thoughts on this question from you all, because I'm sure as lovers of books, as lovers of Seattle and the Pacific Northwest, you have some ideas, some speculation, and I'd love to know what you're thinking. I'd briefly suggest a few things. For too many years, settler societies simply did not value any public form of indigeneity that talked back, that publicly challenged the status quo and provided alternative perspectives. The public chose to valorize and commodify aspects of indigenous life that served the dominant society's interests, which included boosting and marketing the region and its so-called primitive past, the Northwest that was. The local public preferred its indigeneity as uncomplicated, inarticulate, others on the verge of vanishing, best represented in the utter silence of exotic curios at places like the old Curiosity Shop, or displaced totem poles like the Seattle Totem Pole, and the multitude of postcards printed by Lohman and Hanford in Seattle, or Hibben Company in Victoria, which emphasized a decrepit population with essential racial and cultural differences, or represented in Edward Curtis stage photographs of a pre-modern humanity dignified perhaps, but always rendered mute, without political opinions, demands, or commentary on modern affairs. Anthropologists reinforced this view, choosing to believe that indigenous people and their cultures were doomed. Though they valued them for their oral and material traces of the original ancestral cultures that could be salvaged in the name of science and in the name of the advancement of their own professional careers. Indigenous people tapping at typewriters or writing back to the world simply were not authentic enough and useful. And I challenge you to find early 20th century anthropologists, or historians for that matter, who cited native authored publications in their monographs. Consequently, there was little interest in recognizing and preserving a record of indigenous writing in the Northwest, leaving us with a rather uncomfortable archival silence in most regional institutions. Some might say this erasure of voice is a disturbing omission, while others might identify it as a type of paper genocide or epistemic violence, akin to the burning of Puget Sound longhouses and their house posts, or the destruction, the vandalism of ancient rock art sites to make way for settlement. So in the time remaining, I'd like to quickly sketch some of the highlights of this indigenous publishing in the Northwest that is for the most part, with a few exceptions, remained hidden in plain sight. Books and materials that you might encounter in future forays into bookstores and libraries. Let's start with a few books that you might have heard of. Sarah Winnemucca was a Northern Paiute from the Nevada-Oregon border. She served as an interpreter and lecturer for her people when they were interned on the Yakima Reservation in 1879 following the Bannock War. As a chief's daughter, she was well educated and used her status to adopt the persona of an Indian princess in order to lecture in theaters across the United States about the history of her people and the need for Indian reforms. During one lecture tour, she became friends with Elizabeth Peabody and Mary Peabody Mann, well-known New England transcendentalists and educators, and who helped Winnemucca facilitate the publication of her book, Life Among the Paiutes, in 1883. The first autobiography by a Native woman. Keep in mind that she was doing this theatrical and literary activism just a mere 7 years after Custer's defeat at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. A bit closer to us here in Seattle is the iconic figure in Canadian history, E. Pauline Johnson, an Indigenous woman not from the Northwest. She was, in fact, Mohawk, Six Nations Haudenosaunee from Ontario, but lived in the Vancouver, British Columbia area to the end of her life. She, too, was known for her dramatic stage performances, appearing in the first act in her native clothing, then changing quickly to formal European evening wear in the second act. She also did a number of readings and performances for Indigenous audiences in British Columbia, and likely inspired some of those Indigenous people to undertake their own literary endeavors. Perhaps her most famous book, Legends of Vancouver, 1911, drew upon her friendship with Coast Salish elders, Joe and Mary Capilano, from whom she borrowed and recrafted oral stories into prose and poetry. The book was produced rather quickly, sadly, because sale profits were intended to help Johnson in her battle against breast cancer, to which she succumbed 2 years later. We should remember both Sarah Winnemucca and Pauline Johnson for the way they used their writing and stage personas to define modern indigeneity with pride, and also to critique unfavorable representations of Native women that persisted. A third woman, Lucy Thompson, a Yurok woman from Northern California, the Humboldt County area, wrote a fascinating book in 1916 titled To the American Indian. This rare volume is hardly a sentimental elegy for a culture destroyed, but rather a detailed history of her people and surrounding tribes that reads almost like an ethnography, with its intimate description of Yurok rituals, sustainable fishing techniques, and traditional stories. what is important to recognize is the context of her publication, California in 1916. You may recall Ishi, the last of the Yahi, who in 1911, just 5 years before her book was published, was discovered, quote unquote, in Northern California. He was in bad shape, the last of his people, starving, and just more or less let himself be found out of desperation. And he was widely proclaimed quickly in the press to be the last wild Indian, though he survived long enough only to die in 1916 in the only place authorities could put him, as a living exhibit in the Berkeley Anthropology Museum. Secondly, Thompson writes about and condemns settler violence, specifically the massacre of 250 Wiyot on Humboldt Bay in 1860. She did this at a time when virtually no one, much less an indigenous woman, wrote about the many genocidal acts that the state of California sanctioned through the 19th century, a fact that has only been very well documented in the past decade. Thompson's book humanizes indigenous people at a crucial moment and serves as a rebellious declaration that indigenous people had indeed not vanished and were fully capable of using books to represent themselves and their histories. You've probably heard a fair amount about Indian boarding schools, many of them here in the Pacific Northwest. Carlisle, of course, the Carlisle Industrial School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And many of these schools trained young indigenous men in the skills of printing through the school's own print shop. Often these print shops produce school publications, newsletters, journals, commencement programs. You might actually encounter some of these serials, though they're quite rare, such as the Youth's Companion, issued out of Tulalip in the early 1880s. Or the Chemawa American out of the Salem, Oregon Indian School, first printed in the early 1880s and sporadically thereafter into the 1950s. These school publications contained essays, school reports, and poetry written by students. Remember, however, that these boarding schools were often brutal places, designed to kill the Indian, save the man, as the expression went. For every student who wrote and published or learned the trade of printing, there were many other students who administrators treated horribly, violently in Canada. There was a lengthy Truth and Reconciliation Commission that made this very troubling history quite public about 10 years ago, and I urge you to look into that. Long before Billy Frank Jr., was a Snohomish man named Thomas Bishop, who helped found the Northwest Federation of American Indians in 1914, the most important intertribal organization in the Northwest up into the 1960s fish wars. Bishop's leadership eventually led to his becoming Secretary-Treasurer of the Society of American Indians, the leading national Native organization, where he routinely interacted with other indigenous luminaries, as well as powerful members of Congress. Bishop's most important contribution to the written record remains his 1916 booklet, an appeal to the government to fulfill sacred promises made 61 years ago. The first time a Northwest indigenous person published a book to assert treaty rights and critique the violence of dispossession. Though only 42 pages, the book includes a range of literary genres to make his points. At the beginning, Bishop includes a poem to Kobit to stake claim to the Lushootseed name for Mount Rainier. This is followed by the text for the Point-No-Point Treaty, then a detailed letter to an Indian Affairs administrator on the unfulfilled promises of the treaty and current needs of Salish people. It also has a critical reading of Hazard Stevens' glowing biography of his father, Governor Isaac Stevens, who was responsible for all the treaties, negotiating those treaties. And it even has some humorous allusions to Indian agents as trickster-like thieves with magnetic hands, stealing coins straight out of native pockets. This is an important book that should receive far more attention than it has, but it's also very, very rare. Haskell Sherman, one of my favorites, was born Frank Wapato but his name was changed by a Catholic priest after his father was murdered on the family's ranch by Lake Chelan. While Sherman's passionate legal advocacy for the Colville people during the termination era, the 1950s and 60s, is widely recognized, his brief stint publishing fiction before the First World War is hardly known. Having earned a scholarship to St. Martin's College, Lacey, Olympia area, he began to contribute a trove of Western-themed fiction, speculative fiction, science fiction, to the college's literary magazine, The Martian. It inspired him somehow. Sherman was, to say the least, an imaginative fellow, stirred by the anxieties of the impending war in Europe. Let me quickly summarize the plot of one short story to give you a flavor of what he was writing about. The story was titled 1917, but it was written in 1915. Notice the copies of The Martian there, which are also quite rare, but in the St. Martin's special collections. Sherman imagines in his story what the current European war might look like 3 years after its beginning. All of its Europe turns on Germany, but the Kaiser and remnants of his army escape in submarines and transatlantic ships, seeking refuge in the United States, where American film studios and the nation's own wealthy elite prepare to fete the Kaiser and German aristocracy upon their arrival. With U.S. leadership unwilling to resist, armed Germans in civilian clothes take over New York City to greet their emperor when he arrives. And when he does arrive, they form an army to invade Canada. The Canadian militia is easily defeated and the nation conquered, with most English Canadians fleeing to England. Germans from around the world then flock to the new German Empire in North America. Most of Europe declares war on the U.S., but because of its passivity, it's unable to conduct military operations against the United States, having been crippled by the previous war. Peace then reigns supreme in all the war, except Mexico. Why, I don't know, though a fascination with European aristocracy persists. Wow. An indigenous writer from a very small indigenous community, an indigenous writer of full indigenous descent, the first person in his family to get an education. And here he is reimagining how white America might respond to a strange invasion. Sherman uses his undergraduate writing to propel him into law school in Washington, D.C., and eventually his career advocating for veterans and indigenous Americans, both at Colville and throughout the United States. He was a very important figure nationally and in Washington state. His unheralded modernist creativity is certainly worthy of wider celebration as an early indigenous author. It's also important to note that Sherman's brother, Paul G. Wapato, became the first prominent indigenous journalist in the Northwest, publishing front-page articles for Spokane newspapers on impoverished reservation conditions in eastern Washington. A really important indigenous journalistic voice, but I defy you to find historians that actually cite these front-page articles. I wrote a little bit about Philip Howell, a Port Gamble Sklallam man, in my journal article, but he's so important that he merits a bit more attention after helping to establish the Northwest Federation of American Indians along with Thomas Bishop. Howell then becomes the most prolific indigenous author, editor, and publisher in the early 20th century Northwest. He even took a turn as a stage performer and lecturer, known as Jorg Totski, doing a secularized modernist dance interpretation of Coast Salish winter ceremonies. He first published his North American yearbook in 1926 with traditional stories, fiction, and news about Native political leaders. He then issued a series of booklets series of booklets titled Dictionary of Indian Geographic Names. Let me get that up here. That appears to have been his response to Edmund Meany's early booklet on Washington Indian place names. Howell's dictionary modernizes and updates the entries with information and humor appealing to indigenous readers. Perhaps Howell's greatest accomplishment was his newspaper, The Real American, a truly cosmopolitan approach to Indian policy news, science and archaeological discoveries, reservation gossip, sermons from the Indian Shaker Church, and lots of humor, satirizing everything from local indigenous personalities to anthropologists who were trying to conduct their research visiting reservations. The Real American played a significant social role in the Puget Sound area during the 1920s, sponsoring couples dances, beauty contests, and boxing matches. All of Howell's publications contained a variety of advertisements for, let me go back to this here briefly. You can see the bottom illustration there for a couple of them, a variety of advertisements for Indian-friendly businesses throughout the Northwest, serving, as it did through the 1920s, 30s, 40s, as a guide for travel and safely conducting business, much like the Green Book worked for mid-century African Americans. Sadly, Howell died in obscurity, and his path-breaking publishing is rarely cited today. William Shelton, a Snohomish man from Tulalip, is often recognized for his skillful negotiation of economic, cultural, and governmental affairs, always with the interests of the Tulalip people in mind. And his daughter, Harriet Shelton Dover, you may have read her autobiography, which was published through University of Washington Press a few years ago. Achieved the same reputation following in her father's footsteps after he died in 1938. But William Shelton has to be remembered for his unique and innovative practices of combining publishing with the material art traditions of the Coast Salish, serving to both preserve tribal oral traditions and educate a wider public about the value and inherent dignity of indigenous people and their beliefs and customs. In two booklets, Totem Legends and the Story of the Totem Pole, or Indian Legends, in 1923, and then it was a second edition in 1935, Shelton explains the carvings on two-story poles that he carved for public display, art that in the first booklet represented personal narratives of spiritual experiences, and in the second represented ancient narratives from creation times, traditional trickster stories and Duquabal stories, the changer, the one who created the world. Shelton likely saw his indigenized story collections as a response to anthropologists' collections and publications of Puget Salish native stories, which are just being issued, as well as other story collections produced by non-indigenous regional writers, especially all those children's book authors who were appropriating native stories, transforming them, taking out all the certain nasty parts and making them acceptable, sanitizing them, making them sellable to the American public. Shelton was certainly reacting to some of that. Finally, Mourning Dove, the pen name for Christine Quintasket or Mrs. Fred Gawler, is likely a name you've encountered before, as she's certainly the most well-known Native author from the Pacific Northwest, though she is also was an important advocate for the Colville Reservation later in life. Mourning Dove wrote a fair amount of nonfiction prose for newspapers in Eastern Washington, but remains best known for her two books, Cochaweah in 1927, which is the first novel written by an indigenous woman of full descent, inspired by the racist portrayal of Native people in a popular Western titled The Brand, which was published here in Seattle by Harriman. Mourning Dove indigenized the genre of the Western with a Native woman as a protagonist, who, with her intellect, wit, and the thread of literary power, shapes the male-oriented world around her, pronouncing at one point, there's another shot of Cochaweah, in which she pronounces at one point, I may surprise you yet, even if I am a squaw, as you call me, I may use the pen. Her second book, Coyote Stories, is a collection of trickster tales known to Mourning Dove and her people. For this volume, she conducted a book tour, doing readings and signings around the region. You look at newspapers, all kinds of advertisements, photographs of her doing these readings, these events. The first sales tour of its kind by a native person in the area. Combined with the fact that Coyote Stories is one of the first Indigenous authored books in the Northwest to have a dust jacket, signals something about her celebrity status and certainly marketability as an author. There are so many other Indigenous authors and books to be aware of. You're probably familiar with Darcy McNichol's novel, The Surrounded, which is based on his youth in western Montana on the Flathead Indian Reservation, and is perhaps the only canonical Indigenous book to come from the Northwest. It's what graduate students in American literature at universities have to read. So, canonical. It's also one of the first publications written by an Indigenous person or a non-Indigenous person to address the hidden abuses that were occurring in Indian boarding schools. It's coded, but it's there. One might discover a range of other Indigenous cookbooks, recipe books like the ones here from Nia Bay, with a wooden cover, or from the Arctic coast of Alaska. Keep in mind that these kinds of books have even more significance today as Indigenous communities address the issues of food sovereignty, which is the right to protect and access ancestral foods that formerly constituted their traditional diet. And finally, you might also appreciate the many small booklets and pamphlets from Alaskan Arctic communities, Inuit and Yupik. After World War II and the rush to develop the Alaskan North, Indigenous artists and authors began to self-publish small booklets for the emerging tourist market. These small publications, they're really very tiny sometimes to fit in a pocket, usually contain wonderful pen and ink illustrations of traditional life, subsistence activities, and other oral traditions from both ancient times and the historical past. Today, these booklets, I think, are taking on an even more important purpose in the way that they're documenting an increasingly threatened life from climate change. So, why do Indigenous books matter? I'd argue that they're proof of the defiant presence, not an absence, a vanishing, a silence, but an active, creative, intellectual, vocal presence that has contributed time and again to the emergent public sphere of the Pacific Northwest and its written representations of history. Indigenous books and the sovereignty of the printed page have given voice to the historically marginalized, preserved threatened Indigenous cultures in meaningful ways, and projected the lives of Indigenous people into the future. I think it's high time to amplify these voices through new publications, through classroom discussions, and even, I hint, through public exhibitions to enhance access to these rare materials for everyone, including Indigenous communities. It's time to put these Indigenous voices into conversation with other Northwest voices and discover what a fuller, more inclusive regional history looks like. Halslachel, good day, hutch, good thoughts, utegwachud. I thank you all in the Lushootseed language. Hayu Masi, many thanks. That's Chinook Wawa, Chinook jargon. Hoy, we're done. Thanks. Questions?
Yeah, question.
Please.
I've read with great pleasure Zikala Shah, Charles Eastman, Black Elk Speaks, but I discovered a lot of, sort of my access to what you're lecturing about through Helen Hunt Jackson, A Century of Dishonor.
Right.
And I wonder if you have anything to say about white allies in the period that you're discussing.
That's a great question, because if we think about allyship today, they were there. I mean, there were, you know, Helen Hunt Jackson and the Peabodys. There were various missionaries who were not there necessarily, all scattered throughout North America. They were there to proselytize, to transform, but they were also there. Many of them had, you know, Native people's interests in heart. Not all of them by any means, but some of them did. And they acted in certain ways to facilitate the voices of Native people, even if it meant just getting quoted in newspapers. How many of them actually went on to become benefactors, you know, to help these Native people, aspiring Indigenous authors get published? Those were few and far between. There was really only a couple in the Northwest, like L.V. McWhorter out of Yakima, the Yakima rancher, who was certainly, he called himself, you know, a friend of the American Indian. He helped the Yakima. He helped many Native people, including Mourning Dove, Christine Quintasket, publish her books. In fact, some people say that he edited these books and that he was a kind of ghostwriter. I've seen some of these things in manuscript. No, I mean, Mourning Dove wrote those books herself. Like everybody, she needed an editor. But those benefactors, those people, Helen Hunt Jackson, I don't know if she helped facilitate any Native publications in California where she was doing things. But we didn't have that in the Northwest very much, unfortunately. And we needed more of it. And that's why so many of these books are self-published. These were working people, working Native people on and off reservations who were doing logging, fishing, other kinds of jobs. Sometimes they had, Martin Sampson became an engineer after going to various schools and worked at the Cushman Hospital for years, Cushman School and Cushman Hospital in Tacoma. He had some sort of good background, but they didn't have the money. They didn't have the skill set to necessarily be able, and the persona maybe to go into a publisher like UW Press, which was publishing in the 20s, anthropological monographs, and say, hey, would you be interested in this? Why did Bishop have to self-publish that very important booklet on Native rights in 1916? I mean, there were all kinds of presses here in Seattle. You know, Calvert and Harriman and now this, but we all know what they were publishing. They were publishing Costello's The Siwash and other things that were really more or less racist treatments of Indigenous people. The Agonai, exactly. That was where the market was. It wasn't in listening to Native people who were talking back and saying, this is who we are. We are so fixated on orality, the oral, for Native people. Indian eloquence, as the term was used in the 19th and early 20th century. Those wonderful speeches. And yes, they were wonderful speeches. Chief Sealth, Joseph, and all these others. You went into the Longhouse to this day. And I go to longhouses, I listen to leaders, they still have an incredible presence, a deep voice. It's so commanding, so wise. That's where our mind tends to go with Native people. We don't think of them scribbling on paper, writing, submitting it to a press, saying, boom. It's only after the 1960s that really starts to come about with the fish wars, red power, and activism. And especially here in the Northwest. Certain other areas of the country, like New England, there were other people there that were benefactors that were helping do things. And the same thing with the Sioux, Zitkala-Sha and Eastman and Standing Bear and a whole range of them. Nicholas Black Elk, you mentioned, even though he didn't write that, he narrated that. They had friends, they had facilitators, benefactors. Not so many here in the Northwest, allies, especially allies that would get facilitate the printed word.
What about the American Indian newspaper that was published for many years? Are you familiar with that?
Well, there's a lot of them titled The American Indian. Which one?
Well, I think it was published in Kansas. I'm not sure. Haskell Institute, perhaps.
Oh, I mean, there were certainly many newspapers that were published in various areas of North America. Depending on who was publishing it, sometimes it would be a mission press, sometimes it would be Native people, sometimes it would be a boarding school. We always have to remember that if they came from a boarding school, they were almost certainly being censored. They were, they were not going to issue too much that would be counter to the interests of the educational aims of kill the Indian and save the man. It was supposed to be these, the boarding school publications were definitely a way of getting the word out that the school is successful and hey, would you give us some money that we could be even more successful, train even more Native students. So that, there were a range of papers, and I'm not particularly familiar with
This is actually, that's the actual title, the American Indian.
the American Indian.
Not kidding.
And
More of a periodical.
of a periodical. Well, the first periodical was Copway's American Indian, which was actually, Copway was a Canadian Anishinaabe writer in the 1840s and 1850s. And he was a world traveler. He was one of the first people to write about Europe, go to Europe and write a travel literature that was with an indigenous sensibilities. And he went to New York City and for 3 months had Copway's American Indian. But I'm not sure that I would say there's probably about 10 or 20 of publications called the American Indian that were issued on a regional basis. And that's why I'm not quite sure which one it would have been.
Can you talk a little bit about the transliteration of their language into what looked like recognizable letter forms, but impossible to pronounce?
Well,
And I'm going to be able to say the date and that.
well, this is
How did they come up with the alphabet?
oh, well, there's the International Phonetic Alphabet that linguists use, and there's variations of that are often used on a regional basis. Sometimes it depends on the language group of people who are doing it, what they choose to use to best represent the language that they're dealing with. So that, so these languages, remember, there were hundreds and hundreds of tribal nations throughout North America, and that meant hundreds of languages, some of them, very, very different from one another, some of them related. And so, each group of linguists and revivalists who start to bring this stuff back, like Vi Hilbert, she was the one that starts to say, okay, this is the way that we are, the typography, this is the way we are going to represent it. And she chose that, and the best way to look at would be going to the dictionary that UW Press publishes, the Lushootseed Dictionary, and there's an explanation in there at the beginning about how they did it. But then you go just across the border into Canada, and you have suddenly they have differences, even though the languages are different but very much related. Halkomelem, once you go across the Canadian border, you start running into Halkomelem in the Fraser Valley, and many similar words. Chacha, sacred, same here, same there. But there's differences in terms of the glottal stop, the question mark in Hall here. A glottal stop is going to be rendered differently. And it gets very complicated very quickly. I mean, I'm not a linguist by any means. I did not do well in Vi's classes. I loved her and she loved me, I like to think. But there were times she would just shake her head. There were times that she would listen to me and others in her classes, and we'd be spitting out and all over each other trying to learn the language, and she would be in tears laughing. But she didn't want to be doing that because she didn't want to disrespect us. She loved and appreciated the fact that we were trying. but it's very difficult for a non. Oh, yes. Oh, yes, which is why I only speak Lushootseed today really to my cats. Skookum and Sahali, and I try, and I can understand and read a certain amount, but I'm terrible. I just did not do my lessons very well, unfortunately.
To that point, I'm just completing a manuscript for University of Nebraska Press of the Nakota language. And one of the things that I had to include was a chart that lists all the different orthographies that have been used for this language over the last couple centuries. And I think it's 15 or 16. And even in present publication, there's a dictionary that just came out that uses one writing, one orthography, and mine, which uses a different one, because I record it in the underlying form and he's recording it in the surface. In other words, how it actually sounds versus, what actually phonetically it is. So, yeah, it's a big problem. And of course, English, when you think about English, what a mess, right? You have to actually learn, like children in first and second grade have sight words, because there's no way you can get it just from their sounds.
Exactly.
But the native languages, having come into print later, had a very good chance of being phonetic, except you still get that conflict between what's underlying. I'll give you an example. Lakota, Dakota have T's. Nakota has a D. That's because if the T comes between two vowels, it's going to pick up the voicing. Dakota and Nakota don't do that, but Nakota does.
Right.
The
important thing today, native people, native speakers are participating in the process about how that's done. And that's what's
directly. They choose to keep the surface form, and I totally agree. But I also have, I was just up there a few months ago doing working with their immersion school teachers. And I needed to stress the difference between underlying and surface so that they weren't confused when they were teaching. And by all means, teach the surface forms. But if you're trying to figure out how something works, then,
Right.
the underlying form. But, that's a stretch for someone, as you say, who's not a linguist.
And it raises a really interesting point. One of the things, trying to represent native language here in the Northwest in print. Impossible. I mean, people would talk about the guttural sounds. They would do all this demeaning language to describe the language as though it was somehow barbaric and almost pre-human. That was disgustingly racist. But what they did represent in print as the Indian voice was Chinook-Wawa, Chinook jargon, because that could be rendered easily and then printed into dictionaries. Well, it's European influenced, many different native languages and European languages contributed to it. But the problem with that was it was a simplified language. And people got this idea that when native people, a native language, words, sentences, speeches were rendered in Chinook jargon, well, it's almost like Tano talk. It's almost, they were talking heap good, the kind of racist portrayal that you saw with Tano and Lone Ranger, except it was Chinook jargon. And so that was a factor that in terms of people receiving and looking at letters that native people wrote to the newspaper, letters to the editor, of which there are hundreds, even before 1900, the editors and people didn't believe that it was written by a native person because they couldn't speak. They had a terrible or an inferior native language, and then Chinook-Wawa was inferior. How could they possibly be writing and be articulate in the English language? And many, many native people had to show up when they wrote a letter to the editor. They had to show up into the editor's office because the editor would, before publishing it, saying, we think we have a letter, maybe that's from a native person, but we really don't believe that this Siwash could do this, their reception was that was their framework, was Native people were incapable of mastering what was the hallmark of Western civilization, alphabetic literacy, the Roman, alphabet. It took a while for them to do that.
Well, of course, it was self-serving for them to do that, that's my interpretation, and I'm sticking to it.
Mhm.
Because it was a value to them to be able to downplay the intelligence and talents of the
Exactly. I mean, the voice just was not appreciated.
And that's one of the great things about Zit Kalasha and Charles Eastman is they show you, okay, they've been subjected to these boarding schools, but they mastered the English language
Mhm.
and they can speak the language of their oppressor.
Right. And yet the ambivalence that they felt in that, because they were the ones that survived the boarding school process. They knew, like Darcy McNichol in The Surrounded, and he writes this, and he writes about it outside of the novel, that, he knew what the boarding school process was doing to children: sexual abuse, physical abuse, just emotional alienation from their family, from their cultures. And yet every once in a while, one of them could come out and write a nationally recognized novel like he did, as a voice for his people. The ambivalence that they felt, that it must have been stomach churning. And many Native people, I think, felt that tension. It must have been very difficult, especially what we know today about Indian boarding residential schools in the US and Canada.
I'm kind of interested in what the academic perspective is on traditional feelings and writings and teachings on more of the spirit of their spiritual, we might call them supernatural teachings of the spirit or the spirit powers, the search for spirit powers, the use of spirit powers. That's an important part of their culture. I have a friend who was raised with a traditional teacher here in the Northwest, John Moses was given by Hilbert's nephew. And he said that the Northwest had a matrilineal matriarchal society. And when the European government, Western governments took over, they tried to destroy it by moving the men around, but they didn't move the women around. And so the culture is still relatively intact and therefore still secret and hidden. And that's why we don't know very much about the Northwest folks. Spiritual and religious teachings. Vi Hilbert said that she was taught, very difficult for her to talk about them in public. When she went to some of Johnny's teachings, it was very difficult for her because you're not supposed to talk about this in public. And I noticed a severe lack of respect for those teachings. And, when I studied anthropology many, many, many decades ago, there was very much this thing of disdain towards traditional teachings, that there is no such thing as supernatural power. We don't, the only religion is praying to this invisible God. You're not going to find a hidden, you're not going to find where the animals are by using your spirit powers. You're not going to call in fish from the sea by using your spirit powers. And I'm wondering if that's changed. It's been a long time since I've been in academia. I'm wondering if that's changed, if there's some interest in actual learning personally what some of the indigenous teachings are.
I think people defer to Native people who are from a particular spiritual tradition to talk about those things. For example, there's a wonderful book that was written by a former professor of mine, Pamela Amos, called Coast Salish Spirit Dancing, published by UW Press back about '78. Wonderful book talking about what it meant to have to develop, to mature spiritually through a personal spirit power that when obtained through ritual, through ceremony, and so on, and it's reinforced by the social group around you, all very intimate. But the secrecy was, even in pre-contact times, was embedded in it. Secrecy was a form of power, and you kept that information quiet. Now, certain people choose to talk about those things. I think non-Indigenous people would be very unwise to talk about that stuff. unless they had some sort of special permission to do so. They were requested to by an indigenous group. So, for example, if they're providing testimony at a federal hearing or something, let indigenous people do it today. And if they want to talk about certain things, that's, I think, the protocol. Rather than get into depth. I know there are certain individuals, like the individual you mentioned, and sometimes they are very expressive and they like to talk about it as a form of public education. Some people disagree with, some indigenous people disagree very much with that. I've heard, some people get very anxious, very upset over certain information being revealed. Bottom line is that you certainly you might talk about that in an open forum, but if you start putting that into print where it becomes permanent, and it may not be, the majority opinion, but people read it as being, factual in some fashion, that's where people really get into trouble. Many of the writings that I've encountered are Native people trying to explain their religions, the relationship to spiritual power, to the spiritual realm, to the white audience, because we've got to remember that their religion was criminalized up until a certain point. I mean, you had the American Indian Religious Freedom Act in 1978 that really opens the door and states that, there should be no sanctions. There should be no prohibitions on Native religious practices. And that's because it was done, there were prohibitions on an informal basis and on a legal basis against various religious expressions by different Native people throughout North America. Same thing in Canada. So what do you do with that? It's a difficult question to answer because every culture area is going to be different. I think the bottom line is that most people in academia would be deferring to particular members of a particular religious tradition, indigenous religious tradition, and saying, okay, this is the information that you want out there about such and such practices, spiritual relationships that you have. That's what most people would do. I don't know if that answers your question. It's a very difficult question. It's not easy.
Perhaps similarly, in recent years, I've seen a lot of mention of so-called two-spirit gender and that concept. And I wonder if that's got a literary presence for the last decade or two.
It has a huge presence. That's a great question. It has a huge presence today. As a literary presence, there are many poets and writers who are writing about two-spirit perspectives, writing novels, writing poetry, writing histories of the two-spirit tradition of specific cultural areas, like the Dene down in the Navajo people in the Southwest. Anthropologists have written about two-spirit traditions, which are ancient in most, if not all, Native cultures throughout North America. I'm not intimately familiar with a lot of that literature, but I know that it's out there. I would say that over the last 25 years, there's probably been several hundred books written by Indigenous people, by people who identify as two-spirit, about two-spirit themes, whether it's in poetry or fiction or nonfiction prose. It's wonderful to see that literature come to life.
Did you have a presence before 25 years ago? Other than perhaps anthropological literature? Oh,
in the anthropological literature, definitely, yes. I mean, anthropologists would write about all kinds of things. At a certain point, anything sexual, especially before 1900, they always wrote in Latin. Because, God forbid somebody should read something. But then it was coded in a certain fashion. But there was, you look in certain ethnographies and there's often a section there about two-spirit. The role, the traditional customary role of a two-spirit person within a specific culture, a community, because they did have very specific, almost assigned roles that you would be doing this and that, but that they were allowed, that they existed, that they were allowed, and that their people didn't have any problems. There were, you know, this thing that we call homophobia is a Western issue. So I would urge you to punch up Two-Spirit, and I have a, if I could find it, I used to have a handout for my students on Two-Spirit literature and films. There's all kinds of films, documentary films. Two-Spirit stuff comes in The Business of Fancy Dancing by Sherman Alexie, the film. There's, you know, a lot out there.
Well, what I'm trying to get at is, before 25 years ago, were Native Americans themselves writing about that subject at all?
I don't think they had the opportunity, just like a lot of gay Americans, you know, at a certain point, like after the 1960s, I mean, the literature starts, you know, blooming. It's all over the place. But it's there, but it's a lot less frequent. It's in alternative presses, alternative journals, the kind of things that you would find in Red and Black and Left and Bank. But it's not in the major presses. But about the 1980s, it just starts exploding in the major presses. And that's when you really get some wonderful, wonderful material. But it's there, and you know, you can locate it. I'm not an authority on that, but it's very interesting stuff to read, because it's just like reading queer literature today. I mean, it's this wonderful, different, new perspective that, you know, really informs people's lives about, you know, their colleagues, their coworkers, and you know, we need to have that openness, that diversity to reading about other people's experiences and the issues and everything.
I'm not sure I have a question, but I just want to comment that in coastal Pacific Northwest, the role of the mask connected with clothing, costume, and story kind of is its own language alongside of what you talk about with relation to spiritual power, control, secrecy, etc.
Mm-hmm. Oh, very much so. We don't have as many masks here in the Puget Sound area as we do for example, up in the classic Kwakwaka'wakw, the people on east side of Vancouver Island, and the islands in there, the ones that Curtis took so many incredible photos of. But masking, of course, is that ultimate transformation, allowing the expression of all sorts of different feelings. It's a material culture in general. We have this wonderful appreciation of Native art. I mean, that raises this point. We have this wonderful appreciation of Native art. Tim Schmidt, who is not here, carves things, beautiful things. He sent me photographs. We have this appreciation for Northwest Coast art, and of course, the art varies depending on what area of the Northwest Coast you're in, including the plateau, the beadwork of the plateau, and so on. Why have we had that appreciation for that? But the intellectual mind of writers, we've kind of, it's like, you know, I'm not so interested in that. I want this beauty, you know, and it's all about control in some ways, because you can interpret that beauty, that artwork, you can put it in your home. If you're a non-Indigenous person, and say, I appreciate the wonderful, everything that this says about indigeneity, but I'm going to be the one interpreting it in my own mind about why it's meaningful to me. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, we have, my wife and I have Northwest Coast art in our house. It's just, I want to know what they're thinking. You know, I want to know what they're thinking about why we're so fascinated about their art and not about their needs, their politics and so on.
All I can say, that was so, enlightening. to me, because I don't know very much about this at all. I think, and obviously there's some people here in the book club that do, and I appreciate the really good questions that were asked, and it certainly elicited deep responses from Professor Walls, if I may say.